I'm Catherine Arndt, the Chief of the VLGA Connect Studio. Welcome to today's episode, brought to you by the VLGA, your counsellor support network and the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Hello there, welcome to another special pre-election edition of TGU, brought to you by VLGA Connect and sponsored by Hunt and Hunt Lawyers. Today we'll revisit a discussion I had in March of last year with the Deputy Commissioner at IBAC, David Wolfe, where we discussed, among other things, the risks associated with donations and lobbying in local government elections. In the lead up to the formal election period, we'll take an opportunity to revisit that discussion now. What we did want to talk about today are a couple of key reports that have come out from IBAC in recent times. Let's start with the one about donations and lobbying. This has got broader implications even beyond Victoria, which we might touch on. Why is this such an important issue for IBAC?
Indeed, a really important issue for both state and local government. We're talking about two facets of our political democracy, which, if not conducted transparently and fairly, have capacity to impact on decision making. Which could be to the detriment of the broader community. So it's really important that this piece of work was pulled together and published. So I think if we look at it in the two sections, donation for a start, that's a piece of work that we've been talking about in the local government sector for quite some time. As you probably recall, the 2020 legislation had proposed some reforms and it was actually stripped out and it didn't actually find its way into the legislation. And some of those deficiencies are the things we're calling out in the donation framework for local government. I think the really important one for us is centralising the donation reporting framework. So at the moment, it's that disparate framework where donations are reported by candidates to the council and it's collated back into the minister and then through to the local government inspectorate. And then there's the administrative function to find out whether people are compliant or not and action taken against those that aren't. It's a really convoluted system. So we're looking for a centralisation of that. And there's some options already existing around this particularly state level, how it's conducted. We think that will be a good reform. And then aligned with that is real-time reporting of donations. And that's something that I've been quite passionate about as well. I think it's really important that a voter has an awareness of who is supporting a candidate financially before they cast their vote. And I think that transparency is critical to a well-functioning democracy.
This real-time reporting you're talking about, are you talking about at all levels of government, including local government?
Indeed. Yeah, absolutely.
And is that happening in any other jurisdiction, or would that be a first?
There's hybrid models of it. At the moment, a lot of the technical barriers mean that the real time is a day or two or a week after elections are occurring. And my view is that the major benefit is having that information available to the voter at the time they cast their vote. So right. It's a pretty significant reform and it's one that Victoria could really lead the way on.
And I'm assuming that would look like some sort of online dashboard that's updated in real time that people can check whenever they have the need.
Yeah, and particularly, a lot of the voting now is not on that particular day. It's voting past weeks beforehand. So it means the information needs to be updated, but allowances for donations to be received up until a certain point in time. But again, one of the reservations we hear is that people want to donate right up until the election day. My submission would be, what do you need those funds for? Your campaign's already been conducted.
So where are those suggestions sitting in terms of their status at the moment?
So they're sitting with governments. The report in that was tabled late last year, I think November last year, or October, sorry. The government's broadly, in principle, accepted those recommendations and now working through with the about how they might implement.
So there's a lobbying side to this as well. What sorts of observations are you making there?
Lobbying, again, has that ability to influence decision makers, and often it's more concentrated in the state government area, and certainly on bigger proposals or issues where proponents of those proposals have the resources to engage lobbyists to try and get their point across. And again, it's a really important part of the democratic system because the technical and complex information on these proposals often can only be delivered by people with that expertise. So effectively lobbying. But it has implications at local government level And what we found is that the framework to ensure that that is transparent and fair is largely non-existent. So, for instance, a person might be a developer who meets with a councillor and starts to talk about the development that they may ultimately be deciding on. The record keeping and management of that is largely non-existent, and that's something that we'd like to see some significant reforms in.
I'm assuming some of these observations or reforms have been informed by what you as an organisation have gathered in the Operation Sandon matter, which we're yet to see the report of course. Would I be right there?
Yeah, indeed. So some of that was out of our investigative activity. Some of it's done from our research and our comparisons with interstate jurisdictions. But you're right, investigation activity certainly points us towards that. And on Operation Sandon, look, I know the sector is still awaiting to see that report. As most people will know, it's been tied up in litigation for quite some time. And it's been important litigation. It's actually tested out a provision in our legislation, which we now have clarified with the courts, which has been useful, but it's added delay to this really important piece of work. But I can tell you that we're working furiously in here at the moment to try and have that completed and have it published in the coming months.
I suspect not the only report to be caught up in that sort of process.
Indeed, we had a number of reports in the same space, but that pipeline's now freed up. Yeah.
Okay. Anything more you want to say on donations and lobbying before we move on to another very important issue?
No, I think that's good. I just encourage people, if they're interested in it, to go to our website. The reports are freely available there, and it's got some really good and relevant aspects to local government.
I think once you get that government response about what's going to happen next, it would be good to then sort of talk through what is in fact going to be put in place and particularly how it's going to impact on local government.
Indeed. Well, you're right, Chris, and particularly around donations. If there's reforms to be put in place, the clock's ticking for 2024. That'll come around really quickly.
The other report, going back a little while, is the Perceptions of Corruption survey, and there's some insights and some findings here that I think are of particular interest to local government. And against the backdrop of what we've been hearing and reading this week, it's probably more timely than it may have been. What did you survey here? How did you go about getting this perceptions piece done?
So that's a really important piece of work that we've done previously. And again, when you're doing surveys over a period of time, the data is incredibly informative to track those trends. So this piece of work is surveying local government employees to understand their perception of corruption within that sector and where the risks of corruption might arise. So a really important piece of work to inform senior leaders, managers and councillors in the sector, because it's effectively the workforce telling you where the problems might lie. So it's a really important piece of work. And I think there's for me, there was three really important pieces to come out of it. And firstly was that the workforce understand there is a corruption risk and corruption does occur. It was interesting that the numbers that perceived corruption within the sector had risen quite significantly, but not in their actual local government.
Right.
It was always believed to be in another place. And that might, by virtue of the publicity of some of the matters that we're looking into, might create that perception. But still a rise in people believing there was corrupt activity occurring within their council, albeit to a smaller degree. So workforce think it exists. Where they think it exists is around the perennial issues of procurement and recruitment. And recruitment was really prevalent. And again, when I'm talking to council groups, I talk about the recruitment issue around cronyism, nepotism, but also around often there's recruitment activity conducted and there's just not a suitable level of transparency. So it creates that perception of corruption when it might not exist. So a great remedy for that is to be as transparent as possible in that recruitment activity.
Is a good example of that the current issue at Geelong, where the government has felt there needed to be more transparency around the CEO recruitment process, and they've installed monitors. And I've got a follow-up question to this, David.
I think there's what I'm talking about is generally when the workforce have concerns about either internal or external recruitment or promotion, and not understanding why a particular person got the role. I think the Geelong example might be at the further end of the spectrum that needs greater intervention.
And so my follow-up question was, and this goes a bit to some of the Moira stuff around whether there's still confusion or whether there's any confusion out there about which authority deals with which issue, because the inspectorate's dealing with some of those nepotism, cronyism issues, the corruption is IBAC. And there's a mix of stuff in the Moira report, isn't there?
There is indeed. And I guess that's a really good example of having an integrity system where everyone's got a distinct lane which we operate in. Sometimes there is crossover. I often say this when I'm talking to people in the sector, that there ought not be any concern about which body to go to or to raise an issue. We will internally find the best agency to actually investigate and deal with the issue that's been raised. And we might do it jointly, or we might refer it to a particular agency who will operate in isolation. But it's important to note that there is a system to deal with the range of issues. Often it might be a really technical financial issue that we might need Vargo to come in and assist with the financial performance or financial auditing, or vice versa. It might need a unique aspect of the Local Government Act, which is LGI's role. And
of course, the Ombudsman's another actor in that system.
Yep.
What do the results of this perceptions of corruption survey tell us, particularly about local government and how it sits compared to other sectors?
A lot of similarity to the state sector. The same risks are identified. Anytime there's transfer of public funds to private sector, that creates a risk. And if the systems and processes aren't sound, and if the culture of the organisation isn't sound, then there's a risk of improper or corrupt conduct occurring. I think that one of the most important findings out of this survey was the high percentage of people that said that they would report corrupt conduct to their immediate manager. And that's really encouraging. The issue is the manager's got to know what to do. So there's nothing worse than an employee acting properly and reporting that corrupt conduct, and then it not being acted on, not being taken seriously, not being followed through. So I'm talking to managers about understanding what their roles and responsibilities are in advance. So having that awareness and making sure they're acting on those reports. So I think it's really, really important. And one of the other things that came out of it too is what stops people from reporting. And one of them was, of course, that their report wouldn't be taken seriously. And the other one was, of course, around anonymity. So confidentiality of their own personal involvement. And again, that comes back to having an understanding about what avenues are available and what mechanisms are in place to protect those that report corrupt conduct.
One of the side effects of talking about these issues, I put to you, David, is that we often then start to hear from people in the sector who are doing the right thing. And a recent example, LG Pro came out very strongly and appropriately, in my view, to call for a look at the legislative regime that's dealing with councillor behaviour. But it gives rise to the point that it's dealing with a minority. Again, you're talking about corruption, donations, lobbying, etc. Do you think it's fair to still make the observation that the behaviour that raises concerns is happening in the minority of the sector? And what do you say to that?
So we're talking about a couple of different things here. We're talking about corrupt and improper conduct, and then we've got behavioural issues. So conduct. What I would say is that the survey tells us that the workforce perceive corrupt conduct across the entire range of councils in Victoria. And where it is happening in particular pockets, and we know it's happening because of investigative activity, to think that it's not replicated in other areas of the state, I think would be foolhardy. So that's what I'd say in relation to that.
Yeah.
In respect to what LG Pro came out and said, I think that largely relates to conduct or behavioural issues. And I think that echoes frustrations from the professional sector around the level of behaviour of particular individuals in a number of councils across the state, and that frustration is converting into the inability of council to go about their business because they're dealing with conduct issues. And you and I have seen, I don't know how many iterations of a council conduct framework in local government in our time, many iterations.
Yes.
I think what the VLGA are calling for is a look at that to see if there's, again, reforms that can be made to make it more efficient and effective in dealing with those problems when they arise.
Do you support those suggestions broadly that have been made?
I had a conversation only yesterday with a very experienced local government person, and it was along the lines of whether things are getting worse or not. And there's always those conversations, it never used to be this bad.
Yeah.
What we landed on is that the types of behaviours are not new, but we do think it's more broadly spread across the state. So there's more instances of it. So the degrees is not as bad, but the instances are higher. So that means that I think there is a time to have a look at whether the frameworks that are in place are effective or not.
Speaking of frameworks, New South Wales has announced a new framework coming. I'm not clear on whether that's dependent on the current government getting re-elected or not, but have you looked at what they're proposing and how that sits against our framework?
I haven't had a close look at it, Chris, but I've had a look at the drivers behind it, and you look at the frequency of council issues arising in New South Wales. Again, it's on par with what's happening in Victoria. And again, there's that blend between corruption issues. One council in particular is going through an inquiry around that relationship between developers and councillors.
Yes.
But there's many other councils that have issues around behaviour, even financial performance. One's under administration for that. So again, there's a high level of councils that have come under scrutiny for their performance, and there's no doubt that the driver within the New South Wales government is to see what reforms can be made.
Yes, you're right. There's a number of high-profile cases going on in New South Wales with IBAC and parliamentary inquiries. While we're talking interstate, recent developments across in South Australia around campaign donation returns. This returns to our donations issue. I don't know about you, but I had a shudder when I saw what happened here with all of these councillors, 45 of them becoming basically out of office for failing to meet a legislative timeline, eerily similar to what happened in Victoria a few years back, David.
2016, when I was the Chief Municipal Inspector, we had the legislative reform around the requirement to sign the Code of Conduct. We had 116 councils that failed to meet that legislative requirement, which means they were to be out of office on a specified date. And because of that high number, the government took some action to rectify that through a legislative amendment. But what it said to me then, and what the South Australian experience says to me is, it's interesting because the argument at the time was there wasn't enough information provided, the administration didn't inform these people what they're required to do. I looked at it from the other perspective around. It was a really important personal responsibility of the elected members. They weren't aware of the law that existed around their role as councillors, and they failed to meet it. And rather than point the finger at everyone else, our view was it was important that they took personal responsibility.
Look, here's a question without notice that has just occurred to me. So you see these different regimes in different states. There's a hint of this in the Moira report about a lack of, and I'm paraphrasing, I guess, awareness of the way particular things worked in Victoria as opposed to other states. And we are seeing a lot more, I think, movement around the country, people within the local government sector more broadly. Is that a risk that someone needs to be mindful of how that gets managed holistically, do you think?
We often talk about the differences between local councils and neighbouring councils. I think it's really important to have a look around the country and make sure, to an extent possible, there's harmonisation in the legislative frameworks for this tier of government. I think that's really important. So the donations and lobbying report, as I mentioned, we did that interstate comparison to see what the frameworks were in relation to that, and tried to certainly pick out the better elements, but to a degree harmonise what we were suggesting with certainly New South Wales and Queensland. The broader and more consistent the legislative frameworks are around the country, I think the better for everyone.
Well, there's no shortage of material to delve into, with Tasmania and Western Australia also going through reform processes at the moment. David, that's been a terrific, wide-ranging and insightful conversation. As always, really enjoy speaking with you and appreciate you coming on the program.
Indeed. Thanks, Chris, and I'll see you when Sandon is tabled.
Indeed. All right. Looking forward to it. Well, that conversation happened in March of 2023. There's been a lot that's happened since. A number of recommendations, of course, came out of the Operation Sandon report. There's also been recommendations focusing on donation reform from the Electoral Review Expert Panel that handed down its findings in November of last year. And more recently, we saw the attempt in Parliament by the Greens to amend the Local Government Amendment Bill to include provisions around election campaign donation reform. And there was a move at the City of Melbourne to call on election candidates to make real-time election campaign donation disclosures throughout the election campaign. Certainly a hot issue, not going away, and many would argue more to be done in that space. I hope you found that look back useful. We'll have another special edition of TGU for you next week. Until then, thanks for joining us and bye for now.